bringing you information based in fact and science concerning today's marijuana. I'm your host, Chris Wolf, and this is Perspectives. With us today is a subject matter expert from the National Marijuana Initiative, sharing their perspective on the influence that today's more potent forms of marijuana products are having, both in our society and in their field of expertise. Please welcome our guest today, Jennifer Cifaldi. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Jennifer, how can police determine if someone is impaired by marijuana?
Well, what it really boils down to is that police have to have the ability to articulate what they're seeing. And it really comes down to seeing indicators of impairment. Now, those indicators of impairment are going to look different if somebody's under the influence of marijuana versus under the influence of something else, which commonly when we think of driving under the influence, we're talking about alcohol.
Jennifer, how can police determine if somebody's impaired by marijuana?
So what it boils down to is an officer's ability to articulate the indicators of impairment. Okay, and those indicators of impairment are going to look different depending on what substance the person's under the influence of. They definitely look different if they're under the influence of alcohol versus marijuana.
So you use a standardized field sobriety test, and I'm assuming, is that a similar test that they use for alcohol impairment as well?
So the standardized field sobriety tests were originally designed or validated, if you will, for detecting a person under the influence of alcohol. But they can also be used to determine if somebody's under the influence of cannabis. What you're going to see is those indicators of impairment are going to look different because cannabis affects more the executive functions of the brain, whereas alcohol affects more of the motor functions. There's also additional tests other than those standardized field sobriety tests that are accepted by NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and those tests are learned at an advanced class called Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement. So there's some additional tests to the standardized field sobriety test. And you're going to be testing that person's memory a little bit more. You're going to do a lack of convergence, which is whether or not they can cross their eyes. I know that probably sounds kind of silly, but counting tests, things like that, because again, it affects that executive level of the brain. Cannabis does, because cannabis is lipophilic, so it crosses from the blood to the brain as it moves through your system, and it's actually when it's in the brain that it can be very impairing.
Talk a little bit about the DUI search warrant program you established in 2007.
So in 2007, when I was working in one of the Illinois State's Attorney's offices, I was sitting there thinking about how DUIs are the only offense in which a law enforcement officer is allowing the defendant to pick and choose our evidence, and that just didn't seem right to me. So I explored the idea of using a search warrant to compel a person to give a chemical test sample upon the court agreeing that the officer had probable cause to arrest the person for DUI. And the result of that, what we saw was, in my county, was we had over 500 DUI arrests, and they, over the course of a few years, went down to 150 DUI arrests in a year. Probably more significantly was that prior to using the search warrant program, the conviction rate that I had in the courtroom was about 60%, versus when I left the office in 2016 to take this job, I saw that 98% of the people who walked into my court with a DUI left with a DUI on their record as a result of the search warrant program, because we had the chemical test results. And that told me too that officers were correct 98% of the time in their opinion, in their assessment, that that person was in fact impaired.
And was this DUI program that you developed used for both alcohol and marijuana?
Absolutely, any substance. And again, it always boils down to the officer's ability to articulate what he or she is seeing out on the roadway when they're dealing with that person.
And Jennifer, to change gears for a second now, what exactly is law enforcement phlebotomy?
Okay, so phlebotomy is basically a fancy term for a blood draw.
Okay.
And what we were having is, in Illinois, we were having a lot of problems with hospitals not wanting to get involved with the DUI investigations. And, you know, that makes sense. If the person's not a patient, they really don't want to be in the middle of that mess, right, by the law enforcement officers. We were also seeing the need that we needed our blood draws quicker. So if an officer took somebody to a hospital on a Friday or Saturday night and they weren't in need of medical treatment, it was not uncommon for them to sit for hours and wait for a blood draw. So we brought this program to Illinois and we based it off of Arizona's program, in which the officers are now trained to have the person in a seated, safe, and secure environment and clean, and treat them with, you know, care and respect as a patient, and the officers get the training on how to actually conduct the blood draws. And we've seen phenomenal success with it. Our program's based off of Arizona. Arizona's program has been in effect for 25 years.
So the phlebotomy, you know, process is used primarily for suspected marijuana offenses?
It can actually be used for any impaired subject, depending on, you know, whether or not they would cooperate with a blood draw versus some other test. But you can determine if somebody's under the influence of alcohol with a blood test as well, with marijuana, with really any substance, with prescription drugs, you know, you name it. So it's been very successful.
Jennifer, you were always a fantastic guest. Please come back, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
To learn more facts about today's marijuana and its impacts, visit the National Marijuana Initiative's website at www.thenmi.org. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Perspectives.